Welcome to the World of Eora, a news and lore podcast about Pillars of Eternity and Avowed. I'm your host, Eric, aka Gingerino. Thank you so much for joining me as we dive into the history, lore, and game mechanics for the worlds that Obsidian has created for us. Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of the World of Eora. I am your host, Eric, aka Gingerino. Thanks everyone for joining me on another episode as we dive into the history, lore, and game mechanics for Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 and Avowed. If you're new to the show and new to any of those games, wondering why they're all paired together, it's because they share the same fantasy setting known as Eora. And so as the theory goes, if we dive into the, as I said, game mechanics, history, and lore of any of these games, it'll help us get a nuanced appreciation for the world at large and the storytelling that we see within those games. And it's so exciting and awesome to be talking about Avowed in tandem with Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 because the game is out and released. It's super great to be talking about it in this way again. If you are new to the show, welcome to the show. Really happy to have you here. It's a blessing to have you here. If you are looking for a place to start on this podcast, because it is fairly large, it's been running for a few years, you can go and check out episode 0. I am going to re-record an episode 0 pretty soon, so if it seems a little like pre-Avowed-y, that's fine. It will signpost you to some episodes that feature the most important lore of the world, some of the more foundational things. Now again, you don't necessarily need to know the lore of this world to appreciate Avowed or Pillars of Eternity. You can go into any of those games blind. Although, if you want to avoid spoilers for Pillars of Eternity 1, I recommend playing Pillars of Eternity 2 after you're done the first game. But if you don't mind the spoilers for the first game, you can jump in that one blind. But regardless, you don't necessarily need to know any of that lore. This is just a way to lay the foundations for anything that we might discuss on the show. However, today's episode is going to be very beginner friendly for both the podcast and any of the games. And that is because specifically we're going to be talking today about the foundational lore that we see in Avowed. I have not finished playing the game, but I have gone through the first 3 major biomes. And so I do have a lot to talk about in regards to what are the things that we're seeing. Now, I'm primarily going to be focusing on the major factions that exist within this game's narrative, which are primarily the Living Lands, kind of at large, the Steel Garrote Paladin Order, as well as the Aedyran Empire. Those are the 3 major players in the game. But along today's episode, we're also going to discuss your player character, the Envoy of Aedyr, who is also a godlike, what that means. We're going to be talking about some of the issues that are going on within the Living Lands. We're going to be talking a little bit about souls and the Pargrunen dwarves and other countries and nations' influence on the Living Lands. We're going to be talking about a whole bunch of different things, but they're mainly going to focus around those 3 major factions. And the point of today's episode is to help those of you, especially who are getting into Avowed, to understand the impact of what is going on there. Why is it so important, for example, that your player character doesn't know what their patron deity is? Why is that weird, and why does it matter to everyone? I want to try to help set those foundations so that you can understand, if you're a new person to this world, why it's a big deal. But for those of you who are also returning to the World of Eora from Pillars of Eternity, playing Avowed, just kind of re-exploring that lore and really putting ourselves in the mindsets of the developers at Obsidian, as well as the mindsets of these fantasy people that are living in this world, of what it is that they would actually be thinking or experiencing, helping us to really appreciate the stories that we see in Avowed. So that's what we're going to talk about today. As far as news goes, I don't have anything to say at this point. I am pre-recording a lot of episodes in this early phase of the Avowed releasing, just because I'm trying to keep up with playing the game and recording episodes. So if anything really noteworthy happened, I probably already interjected at the start of this podcast to tell you about it. As of this time's recording, not a lot to really talk about. There has been some buzz about people at Obsidian wanting there to be more in the World of Eora. Particularly, there has been interest by a lot of developers to create a Pillars of Eternity-based tactics or strategy game, which I personally would find really interesting. However, it's whether or not something like that can get greenlit. I think Obsidian could greenlight a project like that if they had a small enough team, because they have shown with small teams that they can make some really great games, even in niche genres. However, that genre is particularly niche, so it would really have to have a moderate or very conservative budget, and whether or not they could pull that off, I don't know. Carrie Patel, the director for Avowed, has also stated that she would really like to explore the World of Eora further, whether that means it's Avowed 2 or a completely different story in the World of Eora, we don't know, but there definitely is interest. There's also the potential for a DLC within Avowed to still be greenlit. So we're really hopeful, all of us obviously, that something can happen, but we'll see in the days and weeks and months coming whether or not something gets greenlit if they announce it to us. But outside of that, not really anything newsworthy that I want to bring your attention to, and so we're just going to start talking about today's lore.
I'm curious. What exactly did you find there?
So let's start at the very beginning with your character, your player character of Avowed. Who are you, and what are you, and why do you matter? We're going to talk about that before we talk about the Aedyran Empire, where you hail from. One of the most striking things about your character, which you will notice in character creation, is that you're a weird mushroom boy or girl, and what's up with that? So within the world of Eora, there are these people that are called godlike, and they're almost thought of as an entire race or species unto their own. There are a number of fantasy races within this world. You have the regular humans, elves, and dwarves, but you also have Orlins, which are like small, hairy people with really long ears. In fact, you meet one pretty early on in the game, actually pretty much right after character creation. The little person named Garrick, they are an Orlin character. There's also another type of original fantasy creature that exists in this world called an Amawan, and the first companion you get after the tutorial section of the game, a person of Kai, he is an Amawan, and they're very large. They're way like twice or even larger than an Orlin, and they're not hairy. They actually have like more fishy like skin, and they also have like all shark teeth, like all pointed teeth. They're very aquatically based, although they don't actually live in the water, so they're semi-aquatic. But on top of all those races, you have the godlike. And the thing that makes the godlike interesting is essentially that while a person, or I guess a mother, was pregnant with their child, one of the 11 gods that exist within the Eora essentially touched the child on a soul-based level and made them god-touched and made them godlike. Specifically speaking, they put what's called their chime into them. I like to think of it almost like a divine resonance within their soul, that the two, both deity and the person, are linked. What happens to the person as a result is that while they are born to, like, their elven parents or their Amawan parents or what have you, and they will kind of grow to be the same size as their birth parents, they will have different physiological traits depending on what deity has turned them into a godlike. So the example I usually go with is if the goddess Magren, which is goddess of fire and war, if she was to create a god-touched or godlike person, they would be born as someone who might have fire for hair, or they might grow demon horns out of their head as they age. They might have obsidian black skin, or they might have flames in their eyes. There might be sparks that crackle and follow them wherever they walk around. There are these physiological expressions of their godlike status. As well, they're often accompanied with some level of power. Some godlikes might cause decay and entropy around them. If that was related to the god Remergon, for example, some might have an aura of healing, some might have an aura of heat or cold. It depends on the god in question. Now that's the physiological and like things like that. However, there's also sociological things as well. Some cultures view godlike as blessings, but some of them view them as curses, depending on the god that blessed them, because each nation likes and doesn't like certain gods within the pantheon of this world. The gods that exist in this world are brute facts. Like, they do exist. It's not a question of, like, do the gods exist or not. The gods of Eora definitely exist, and everyone on the planet knows the gods exist in some way, shape, or form. It is a largely accepted and demonstrated fact of history. Same thing with the soul. The soul is not a matter of contention within this world. It actually exists. And in fact, not only does it exist, there is actually a science dedicated to studying the stuff the souls are made of. Souls are made up of essence. It's not a corporeal thing. It's incorporeal. It's kind of ethereal, but it is still a substance of some sorts, and that's what the soul is made of, is essence. And so the science of animancy is about studying that essence. And so your character is a godlike person, which means that one of the deities blessed you when you were born. The thing that is really weird about you as a godlike is you do not know who your patron deity is, and that is very odd. Never in the history, at least as far as we know from playing Pillars of Eternity and Avowed, that there has been a person who has been born as a godlike who didn't know who their patron deity was. There's not really a lot of reason for the god to hide that from you. And it's also usually pretty apparent. If you are born with fire for hair, you're probably a godlike of the goddess of fire. This is why at different instances in Avowed, some people mistake you as a Gallowayne godlike because you have these natural things on you. You have a lot of these like fungus-based or tree-based things that are growing out of you, and that's very connected to the god of the hunt/nature, Gallowayne. And so people kind of assume that about you. But you particularly don't know that about your god, and that you don't know what your god is, and that is weird in the world. Not just because, oh, you don't know, and that's weird because it's weird, but it's weird in the sense of like, why would a god keep that secret from a godlike? Maybe Wal would do that, god of dreams, secrets, mysteries, and revelations, but why would any god other than that really keep it secret from the godlike? It raises a metaphysical and existential question amongst other people that is very much against the norm, but no one has an answer to that question, so they just kind of accept it and move on. But it is definitely a weird thing. It makes you a freak on top of already being kind of a freak. And so you are a mystery godlike, and you are sent to the living lands to investigate a dream scourge. This dream scourge, I'll probably talk about it a little bit later. A dream scourge is a soul malady. As I've already said, the soul in this world definitely exists. It is a fact of this world. There's no contention on that. And just like the physical body can have physical maladies, the soul in this world can have soul maladies. The soul in this world is often related to memories, consciousness, and like morality, and amongst other things. And so when there is a soul malady, it affects those things. You might have immoral or amoral attitudes. You might have memory fluctuations. You might have diverging personalities or drastically changing personalities. Or you might have things like the dream scourge, which are described by many as being in a waking nightmare. It's almost like people can't differentiate between the dream world and the real world, and are so acting out what's happening in their dream. As well, there seem to be these physiological expressions of mushrooms growing off of the individuals that are afflicted with the dream scourge. These people are often referred to as dream thralls. Now, you are sent by the Emperor of Aedyr as his envoy to investigate this because he views it as some kind of a threat. I have a couple theories as to why he might really be thinking about it, or perhaps it is just face value. He wants someone to figure this out. But let's take a step back and talk about the nation of Aedyr, the first major faction that I really want to take a look at, because you are an envoy of the Aedyran Empire. And if you're new to this world, you might not know who the Aedyran Empire is. Obsidian has done a really good job of giving you new players tool tips and information to be able to read up as much as you want to understand what the Aedyran Empire is, but they don't force it down your throat. You're able to kind of soak it in through the narrative, I think, at an acceptable level. However, for those of you who might be like, I want a little bit more, or like, I don't feel a deep connection to this character or what's happening in the world, hopefully this kind of stuff will help you. Now, a little bit of history about the Aedyran Empire, especially since we're talking about the Emperor. The Aedyran Empire at the current state within Avowed, they have an emperor and an empress, I guess you could say. They have a king and they have a queen. Very often, the king will be a human male. And very often, the queen will be an elven female. I don't think that there is any recorded evidence within any of the lore of those ever differentiating, of there being a male elf or a female king kind of a thing. Like, there hasn't been a mixed match. It's always been a human male king, and it's always been a female elven queen kind of a situation. The reason that there is those two particular individuals matched up in the monarchy or like the royalty of this nation is it's representative of the origins of the Aedyran Empire itself. Before the Aedyran Empire became the Aedyran Empire, there were these two different groups of people. One was a group of humans called the People of the Deer, which is what Aedyr literally translates to in their old language. You had these People of the Deer, which were largely comprised of meadow humans, which is a subspecies of the human species within this world. And so you had these meadow humans that were in, theoretically the meadowy areas of the continent that we now know as Aedyr. And then you had these wood elves or shelter folk that were living in the forested region of this continent. And this forested region was referred to as the Seathwood. and the elven tribes in the Seathwood were the Colclan elves. So you had these people of the Deer, meadow humans, and you had these Colclan elves of the Seathwood, and they were often kind of, at odds with each other. There were often a lot of border skirmishes and territory disputes, and there were wars and battles between these two civilizations. And then after a long-standing history of, skirmishes and conflict between them, they eventually kind of united as one empire. Now, it's often presented in the history books as a peaceful uniting. Obviously there were still battles and wars going on, but they decided to unite peacefully. I do have a bit of skepticism, wondering if perhaps the meadow humans, the people of the Deer, won, for lack of a better word, a war, and they rewrote history to make it seem like it was peaceful, but that's just skepticism on my part. There's nothing to support that necessarily. Either way, the people of the Deer, the humans, and the Colclan elves of the Seathwood, they united into one nation, the Aedyran Empire. And that's where the Empire got its roots, that's its origins. And so that's why there is a human male king and that there is a elven female queen, is because it represents the two different societies that came together to form one. Now, the king of Aedyr is technically called the Fair Coning. That's the Aedyran name for him, or Eldadyran, which is like, if you think of Aedyran as English, Eldadyran is my idea of basically Old English. It's not a perfect analogy, but anyways, in Eldadyran, the name is Fair Coning, which refers to or translates directly to First King. The queen is called the Hea May Queen, which directly translates to Illustrious Queen, often just kind of shortened down to May Queen. For the sake of Avowed, they often just refer to them as King and Queen or Emperor and Queen. I think for simplicity's sake, and also it's just kind of like a commonplace language. That's the way they talk at that point in time. And so the Fair Coning and the May Queen, they often are operating under their own auspices. So like the Emperor, for example, he has you as an envoy. It's not the King and Queen sending you as an envoy. You are there at the Emperor's behest because he is representing that side of the society, even though they are united as one. And the Illustrious Queen, the Empress, or whatever you would like to call her, of Aedyr, she is often also often sending people out on her own campaigns as well, even though they are united in marriage. As a side note, there is an interesting institution of marriage within the world, or the nation of Aedyr, because there's no interbreeding within this world. So like the king and queen and any other human male or like elven female or whatever, there's no interbreeding between species. So sometimes there are these like external marriages that you can have to procreate children for a family where the primary parents are people of different races. It's called Heimnig. But anyways, we don't need to talk about that right now. That's just a little side tidbit of lore for you. So this is the nation of Aedyr that you are an envoy from, that you are a representative from. You would have been born and raised into this empire. You would know its values and you would know its operations, especially being so high up within the administration on the emperor's side. Now, as far as like the values of the Aedyran society goes, they are a lot more, I would say, conservatively minded. If we're using our own Earth world kind of notions, definitely more conservatively minded in my personal opinion. Obviously they are a complex nation in their own right, and so there are different leanings and all sorts of political spectrums, but it definitely seems like more often than not conservatively minded by our own modern standards. And they are very heavily associated with the goddess Woodica. Woodica, as I've mentioned the gods already, Woodica is one of the 11 gods that exist within this world, and she is very closely tied to the Aedyran Empire. We don't see a lot of other nations or factions within the world that are at the same kind of superpower level that Aedyr is at that also follow the goddess Woodica. And that isn't to say that other people don't worship her, it's just something I've kind of noticed. Because Aedyr is one of the major superpowers within this world. They are the people who can go to the living lands and bring an entire people group. They are the nation that helped colonize the Dyrwood, which is the setting for the first Pillars of Eternity game on a completely different continent altogether. The Aedyran Empire are one of the worldwide superpowers, along with another nation called Rawatai and another one called Grand Valia, the latter of which is now defunct and collapsed. But returning back to Aedyr, they definitely have a strong tie to the Church of Woodica. And the Church of Woodica is, for lack of a better word, is the state religion. I don't know if it is imposed as a state religion necessarily, but it is very closely tied to how the society operates and thinks. So they have this tie to Woodica. Now, Boudica is the goddess of rightful rulership, law, and justice, and vengeance, amongst other things. Given those descriptors, most of which sound pretty positive, you might be willing to think that Boudica is one of the quote-unquote good gods, if you're thinking of it in terms of morality. I personally definitely think of her as one of the more evil gods. She is a merciless and ruthless god. There is no wiggle room for error. She is very much graceless in that sense of like you either toe the line or you suffer the consequences. And you can learn a lot about Boudica from the Pillars of Eternity games and what her views are on mortal creatures and what her main motivations are, which seem to be about gaining as much power as possible. Boudica is a god who, mythologically speaking, is referred to as the Burned Queen because it is, and again, this is mythological, so I don't know if this is necessarily true, but it's presented within the mythology of this world that Boudica was at one point the queen of the gods. She was more powerful than the other gods, and she was in charge of all of that. However, the other gods conspired against her and used the fires of Pargrunen, who I've previously mentioned is the goddess of fire and war, used her divine fires to burn her and her power and exile her from her rightful place on the throne as queen of the gods. And so worshippers of Boudica, often which are, lawyers and judges and whatnot, refer to the day when the queen takes her throne back. And it refers to this day when Boudica is back in power again, and she will make the world in her own image and conform it to the laws that she has set. Again, whether or not this is actually true, whether she was the queen of the gods, we can't really verify, and there hasn't been any for sure confirmation that it didn't happen. I have skepticism in either direction, but it also involves talking about lore that's a little bit spoilery, and I don't want to get into that. But that is the mythology behind Boudica, and you can definitely see that in some of her motives. When you do interact with narratives regarding her in Pillars of Eternity 1 or 2, and possibly in Avowed, I don't actually know yet if she's involved in Avowed in any way, though I have my suspicions. She definitely seems like she is trying to get that power back or get it for the first time. So there are things that she is willing to do to gain power within this world, and she has attitudes and views on the world and mortal people that allow her to do those things from her own moral perspective. Boudica is very often presented in an antagonistic fashion to the narrative that involves the player character. Whether or not she is the antagonist, I will leave up to you if you play the games, but anyways, that's how she is presented. Now, Boudica is also very heavily associated with another faction that we see in Avowed, which is why I suspect that she is involved in the Avowed narrative in some way, and that other faction is the Steel Garrote paladin order that we see in the game of Avowed. So we've talked a little bit about the Aedyran Empire coming to the Living Lands, which is a very interesting thing on its own. We'll talk about it when we get to the Living Lands part of today's episode. But alongside the Aedyran Empire coming to the Living Lands, we also see the introduction of the Steel Garrote. Now, the Steel Garrote, or Garrote, I pronounce it as Garrote, is a paladin order, and which a paladin is essentially a martial zealot. They are an order of people who are united either at a god or an idea or a philosophy or a lifestyle way of living or values, etc., and they live by a specific code and order, and they live out that particular code or order or lifestyle in what they do. The Steel Garrote, for example, their main prerogative is to seek out people that are referred to as oathbreakers. Oathbreakers are essentially people that were in some form of a contract and they broke that contract, and now they are on the run rather than seeing the consequences of such broken contract. The Steel Garrote don't really care for the morality of any contract. They mostly just hunt down people who would do such a thing like break oaths. Boudica is heavily associated with oaths and promises and fulfilling contracts, and so that's part of the reason they do that. The Steel Garrote seek out these individuals called oathbreakers, and they often bring them to quote-unquote justice, which usually means killing them, often via strangulation, which is Boudica's preferred way of executing people. And so the Steel Garrote are also very tied to Boudica. The Steel Garrote are more tied to Boudica than Aedyr are, even though Boudican Church is kind of, for lack of a better word, the state religion in that empire. The Boudican followers in the Steel Garrote are very zealous. They are extremist, especially the one that we see in the game of Avowed within the setting of the Living Lands. These people are dedicated to their paladin order and to following Boudica and upholding her values and her rule and her structure. And they are following their leader, Inquisitor Ludwine. Now, Inquisitor Ludwine is the leader of this Steel Garrote chapter that we see in the Living Lands, and she is here on her own agenda, which I haven't gotten to learn a lot about yet, frustratingly so. I have some suspicions on what they may or may not be. Inquisitor Ludwine is a very interesting character in the game of Avowed, not just because she is the leader of this faction that you can or cannot ally with, depending on your choices throughout the game of Avowed. She's also very interesting in her dead set focus on whatever it is she is here to do. She is an incredibly intimidating and zealous person, and very radical, as well as just extremely focused on one thing. Now, there's an interesting thing that I heard someone say as I was walking through the introductory areas of the game of Avowed, that people were saying that there's a rumor that Inquisitor Ludwine actually died in the Deadfire, which is the setting for the second Pillars of Eternity game. And you can actually interact with Inquisitor Ludwine in the Pillars of Eternity game, in that second one. So she is a recurring character for those coming to Avowed. But there's apparently a rumor going around that she actually died in the Deadfire Archipelago, but Woodica brought her back to life again. Now, it's presented in a very kind of like, whoa, I can't believe it kind of a way, in that maybe you aren't supposed to believe it. Like, it is very much a rumor. But I do want to point out that this is technically possible within the world of Eora. There is possibility that a person can become undead by multiple means, even if a god was to perhaps do it. It's definitely possible. It doesn't happen very often. It's incredibly notable when it does happen, and there is a degree to which why it might explain why Inquisitor Ludwine is so laser focused on whatever mission she has here in the Living Lands, and is willing to even go outside of her paladin's parameters and what they're supposed to do. They are not the official military of Aedyr, but their origins are in the Aedyran Empire, and they are heavily associated with Aedyr, to the point that when people see the Steel Garrote doing things, they equate them to the Aedyrans wanting the same thing, which obviously causes problems for you as the envoy, depending on how you're role-playing your character. And so if Inquisitor Ludwine turned out to be kind of this undead-ish character, I don't want to talk about it too much, because if she does turn out to be the way, I would be spoiling that. But like if there was this resuscitated trait to her character, there is a degree to which that it would contribute towards her motivations. And I don't want to speculate too much, just in case I'm right. But I do figure that those audio barks in the early game must mean something. So maybe it could also just be false. Perhaps she is just a very, very focused and dedicated person. We don't know. I don't know everything about the character yet. She just might be that way. But it is interesting to note that there is some wiggle room within the lore to say that, well, maybe she is some sort of a zombie, and we'll see. Anyways, moving on from Inquisitor Ludwine, the Steel Garrote are here at her behest. Now, she is leading them to do things in the Living Lands, which is not necessarily sanctioned by the Aedyran Empire, which means they are following out of their jurisdiction that they kind of place themselves within. They're supposed to be there kind of as an arm or an extension of the Aedyran Empire, and they're also supposed to be there to seek out Oathbreakers. But it seems like Inquisitor Ludwine has a specific agenda that she is moving towards. Again, I don't know what that agenda is, although I have my speculations, but it involves spoilers, so I'm not going to talk about them. But she definitely seems to have a reason that she is here. And the Steel Garrote Paladins will, as they are going to follow Inquisitor Ludwine, because, they are dedicated, zealous Woodican worshippers, and Inquisitor Ludwine is their rightful ruler, and so they will follow her rule of law, and she has the final say on whatever it is that she's doing here that has something to do with the Dream Scourge. Now, this leads me to the last major, faction, if you will, of this game, which is the Living Lands kind of in general. Because you have the Aedyran Empire, which have sent you here in some way to eradicate the Dream Scourge. My suspicion is that the Aedyran Emperor wants to colonize the Living Lands, because we have seen Aedyr colonize other parts of the world, but I think he has concerns that this Dream Scourge would eradicate or decimate part of his army, and then he doesn't have the army available for other campaigns or projects, and it also might hurt their colonization efforts. So he wants someone to go in, investigate it, see if it can be eradicated, and then he can send his people over. Because Aedyr is obviously already here trying to start a colony under the guise of bringing law to a lawless frontier that is the Living Lands. And so that's my suspicion for him. I don't know what Inquisitor Ludwig's motivations are. I do find it interesting, though, that of the two non-Living Lands factions that Obsidian chose to be involved as major factions in this narrative, they are both aligned with Woodica. And so I have a suspicion that the goddess Woodica is operating behind the scenes in some way, shape, or form. Whether or not she's orchestrating everything or whether or not she really isn't technically involved directly, I don't know. I'm just speculating. But it seems like an interesting coincidence. And so I'm going to pay attention to that, and I hope that you will kind of pay attention to that as well. If you're interested in learning more about Woodica, I do an episode on her that you can listen to. But returning back to the concept of the Living Lands, I bring up the Aedyran colonization within the Living Lands because it's important to consider what the people in the Living Lands are here for. The Living Lands is a really interesting setting because it is one of the lawless frontiers of the world. It's one of the most dangerous and untamed places within the world, alongside the Deadfire Archipelago, which is an archipelago of islands. I guess that was redundant anyways, but it's a setting where it hasn't been tamed. Like, the people haven't established society there and absolutely conquered and created authoritative rule in that area. It is lawless in a certain sense. There are tribes that exist in the Deadfire Archipelago, mind you, that they have their own society, but it is a kind of lawless frontier for the three major superpowers of the world, Aedyr, Rauatai, and Grand Valia. The other wild frontier that has yet to be tamed and conquered is the White That Wins, which is essentially Antarctica, so I don't see anyone going there anytime soon. The Living Lands is another such place. It is a wild and verdant and lush continent with varying degrees of ecology from mountain range to valley and mountain range to valley, as we see from playing the game. This continent, this very large island, has more life to it and more dangerous creatures in it than anywhere else in the world. It is explorer's paradise, but also their hell, because it's a dangerous place to explore, but it's also untouched by a lot of kith. Kith is the word that are used for generically the civilized races within the world. And so it is one of those lawless frontiers that have yet to be explored and established and conquered, for lack of a better word. And a lot of people have come to the Living Lands to escape such places. They don't like to be in the nations where there is this rule, or perhaps they are criminals that are on the run, or they're people that want to start a fresh life, but they don't want to do so in the nation they're in or move to another nation. So people are coming to the Living Lands, and we're seeing this in the various settlements that you can interact with through the game of Avowed. In Paradis, you have a number of people here who are just wanting to start a fresh life for themselves, and they have set up this settlement within an old Pargrunen fortress. Pargrunen I'm going to touch on in a little bit. In the settlement of Fiorme Everno, which is the settlement you see in the second major map or zone within this game, there are a group of scientists who want to be free to study the science that they are pursuing without any sort of level of regulation. And some really interesting things come out of those narratives. If you go to the third biome of Shatterscarp, there's a settlement there called Thirdborn, and it's largely a lot of people who are on the run for various means, who kind of set up shop here, for lack of a better term. I don't want to talk about that too much because it's starting to get more into spoiler territory. In the last section of the game, which I'm not currently in yet, so I don't know, but I'm just kind of reading up on it, Galawain's Tusks, we have a place called Solace Keep, and that's where the Pargrunen dwarves, who have kind of been in the Living Lands for the longest at this point, that are still here anyways, they have set up a very isolated keep in that region. I don't know anything about them, but it seems like this is one of their places that they have stayed and settled down in, and they're kind of isolationist as a result, and this is where they are. This is kind of their home. So you have all these people here who have come to the Living Lands for various reasons, largely for their own reasons. And a very interesting thing about the political narratives of Avowed is that you now have the Empire of Aedyr coming to the Living Lands, imposing their rule and their law and their structure upon a place that people were trying to escape a lot of that stuff from. And to make matters even worse for them, their introduction into the Living Lands and these various settlements have also displaced a number of people outside of where they were living. So the major example we see this is the first region, which is called Dawnshore, in the city of Paradis. A number of people have been moving outside of the city walls because the Aedyrans essentially took over large sections of the city. And so this is obviously causing a lot of tension between these Aedyrans who are here essentially colonizing the area, who are trying to introduce a level of law to this lawless land, but there's already people here who don't want that. And that leads to a lot of contention, which is where you, the envoy, come in. You're trying to deal with the Dream Scourge. That's what you're sent here to deal with. And you have to interact with living land people, often referred to as living landers, in order to do that. But they don't like you very much because you come from this empire that are trying to impose their law and their rule in a land where it's not asked for. And so you're caught in the middle ground. And you can roleplay any character you want. You can heavily align with Aedyr and be very patriotic and say, like, actually, it's, this place is getting populated enough that it's probably good for you to have some law and order, and we're a good nation to do so. Or you can start to side with the living landers and be like, hey, I might be from Aedyr, but I am not aligned with their values right now. I'm just here to deal with this soul plague, kind of a thing. The extra complication in this, however, is the introduction of the Steel Garrote, because they are so extremist that they are willing to go places that the Aedyran Empire's army is not. But because the Steel Garrote is so heavily associated with Aedyr, their actions are also often perceived as Aedyran. And so you have the Steel Garrote performing these very extremist, radical acts within the living lands as a setting, and then these people are looking at Aedyrans and you, the envoy of Aedyr, saying like, hey, you're with them, and that makes it even more problematic. And again, you can roleplay as a Steel Garrote person. You can be like, no, I am fully on the Steel Garrote side. They are aligned with Woodica. Woodica's my god. Whatever they're doing, I'm all for it. You can shut up or I'm going to beat you up. Whatever it is that the Steel Garrote would say, you can align with that. You can roleplay really well within this game, and I very much appreciate that. And so it's into this like political landscape that your character walks into. And that's partly why I'm making this episode today, because I want you to understand these tensions that are going on, the history of Aedyr, why it is the way it is, and the like sense that they have of, we know what is good for these people, that's why we're coming here to colonize it. But also understand the Steel Garrote and how they are their own entity, but they're heavily associated with Aedyr, and how you're in the middle of all of this, and it's really difficult to navigate. In future episodes, I will try to dive more into the specifics of like your role within like the Emerald Stair region and what's going on with animancy over there. But for now, we're just going to kind of talk about like this kind of overarching sense here. And so the last thing that I want to mention, I didn't really fit into any of these other topics, but I do feel is worth mentioning because it is something we see throughout the entire game from the front to the end, or at least I think so. I haven't gotten to the end yet, is the Pargrunen dwarves. And the Pargrunen dwarves are very interesting because they have been in the living lands for a very long time. They established a keep here, Solace Keep, a very long time ago, and they have established other fortresses throughout the living lands, and in fact, you will be exploring them pretty much right at the start of the game all the way up till the end of the game. The Pargrunen dwarves are a society or civilization of dwarves that originally hail from Old Valia or Grand Valia, which I mentioned was one of the superpowers of this world, but that civilization has now collapsed at this point in time. The Pargrunen dwarves are known for their wanderlust. They have largely explored the entirety of the globe, or at least the known world, and you can see dwarven ruins of the Pargrunen dwarves virtually everywhere, and most of these places are abandoned. There are very few places within the world that actually have established settlements where they have stuck and stayed. One is Solace Keep in Gallowayne's Tusks. One was Durgan's Battery in the White March, which is a place you can explore in the first Pillars of Eternity game if you have the White March DLC. And another one, I believe, is in the Collapsed Society of Grand Valia. They do have a keep there. I think there was a fourth one in the world, but I'm not sure where it is, and it's not important to talk about now, so I'm not going to get into that. But the Pargrunen dwarves are a society of dwarves. They have their own culture. They have their own society. I'm really excited to see some books within the Living Lands and the Avowed game called The Maxims of the Pargrunen that we can learn a little bit more about their society. But if you're interested in learning about the Pargrunen dwarves, I've done an entire episode on them that I think is worth diving into because they do have their own culture. They have their way of looking at the world, and they're very interesting to get into. One thing I think of note for Avowed is that they are very isolationist, it seems, in this particular game, and they are known often for their wanderlust. You get to learn a little bit about them with Marius, but he has been very closed off to me so far in the game, so I haven't learned a lot about them. But you do see them in Pillars of Eternity 1, and a little bit, I guess, referenced in Pillars of Eternity 2. But they were not the first people in the Living Lands. I mean, technically we'll never know who the first people are in the Living Lands, but the Pargrunen dwarves have clearly been here for a while. Because as you're exploring the Living Lands in the game of Avowed, you are going to run into old Pargrunen ruins, these walls that are starting to crumble as like the, vegetation overcomes them or creatures are destroying pieces of it. Like you can see ruins of their settlements and fortresses everywhere that you're going. So they very clearly had a presence in the Living Lands. But there is a group of people that have been in the Living Lands far before the Pargrunen dwarves, and that is the Godless people. And this is something we heard about before the game came out, so this isn't spoiler territory at all. Essentially, the Godless are a civilization of people. At this point, they would be considered an ancient civilization of people that were in the Living Lands. And they also have ruins throughout the entirety of the game of Avowed, and it is a large mystery as to what happened to them, what was their culture like, why did they not have any gods that they worshipped, even though everyone knows about the 11 gods of the world of Eora. Like, why did they not have a god that they mentioned, kind of a thing. And no one knows their language. There's a whole bunch about them. They are an ancient race and civilization of people that were in this land, and we don't know a lot about them. So they're very interesting. And obviously, a lot of what they did in the Living Lands will tie into the narrative of Avowed. That's why they're mentioned. That's why they get repeated. And one of your companions, Yahtzee, is a scholar of this stuff, and she is researching the Godless and trying to learn more about them. I'm getting to the part now where I'm really learning a lot about the Godless, and I find them fascinating, where they might have come from, what their motivations were, what they were doing in the Living Lands. There's a lot of really interesting stuff about them, and I'm hopeful that you will kind of gain that stuff as well as you go. And so you walk into this game of Avowed, you have all these different things. Like, you are an envoy of the Aedyran Empire, so you're trying to represent that, but you're also trying to be yourself. You're also a godlike of an unknown god, and you start to have some of your powers changing and manifesting, and some of your godlike stuff, for lack of a better word, starts expressing itself differently when you start to get to the Living Lands. So you clearly have a tie to the Living Lands in some way, but what might that be? Why are the Godless involved in the narrative at all? Why did Obsidian create them for this narrative? What's their part in the whole story? What does animancy have to do with this all? What about the Steel Garrote? Or, like, there's so many things coming around. And you are at the center of all of that with the Aedyran Empire, the Steel Garrote, and the people of the Living Lands, and the Living Lands history as well, tying to you as a person, not just as a political figure, but you as an existential person. And there's a lot of topics about politics and existentialism in this game I think are really fascinating to kind of like, you know, percolate on and think about. And I've really been enjoying the things that I've read so far. So those are, I think, largely the major topics to talk about. I've kind of given an overview of these major factions as well as some connective tissues and pieces of lore. If you're interested in any of those topics, I have pretty much done episodes on all of those topics in some way, shape, or form. The Pargrunen dwarves, the Living Lands, the Nation of Aedyr, the Steel Garrote Paladin Order, as well as like different political issues, the Godlike, and animancy, and the gods, and souls, and the Wheel of Reincarnation, which I didn't talk about yet at all in this episode, but there is a cycle of reincarnation that exists in this world where a person dies, the soul leaves the body, goes to the beyond where the gods supposedly are, and comes back into the world again. That's an important part of the world. But I'm not going to talk about it at depth on this episode because I want to save some topics about that for a future episode because I think it's important there, and I don't want to keep going on. So let's start closing out today's episode.
If you find your trail has run cold, come to me with whatever you have. There is much I may be able to do for you.
Before Avowed came out, I would usually leave a section here to say, how does everything we talked about connect with Avowed? But I mean, we've been talking about Avowed the whole time, and so if I can, I'd like to try to connect anything to Pillars of Eternity. But I've also actually been talking about Pillars of Eternity. All this lore that I've talked about, we've learned from Pillars of Eternity, like where Aedyr comes from and what they're about and what I was able to tell you. That's all stuff that we learned from Pillars of Eternity. Same with the Steel Garrote and the Inquisitor Ludwig's. A lot of this pulls from Pillars of Eternity. And so in that vein, what I'm planning to do on every episode is read for you one piece of lore, like whether it's a unique item description or a book from the game of Avowed or Pillars of Eternity. I'll read that on as we close out the episode as like our closing piece of lore. And I can't think of a more appropriate one than the book in Avowed called Pillars of Eternity. Now, this is an in-game book that you can pick up pretty early on in the game. You can actually pick it up in the tutorial section next to a large piece of Aedyr, which is that green gemstone looking kind of stuff that you will see throughout the entirety of the game. Aedyr is very important to the metaphysics of this world because souls can go into and out of Aedyr, and I'll talk about it in future episodes when we start talking about souls and the wheel and animancy. But for now, just leave it at, you can find this book titled Pillars of Eternity in front of one of these Aedyr, and this is what this book has to say. Aedyr is a green crystal found throughout the known world, emerging from the crust of Eora in the shape of iconic pillars. We cherish Aedyr, build our temples around it, study its potential as an energy source. But Aedyr is so much more. When we die, Aedyr is the road on which our souls travel into the beyond. And when our souls are ready to return, Aedyr shines a lantern guiding us from death into life. When you find yourself in the presence of Aedyr, take a moment to ponder your place in the Great Wheel. Consider who you were, who you are, and who you can be. That's the reading of the book of Pillars of Eternity by Gingerino. Anyways, so to kind of go through this really quickly of like some of the lore we see here, this essentially describes what Aedyr is for you. This is why Aedyr is so, central to the entirety of this world. In fact, the games of Pillars of Eternity are essentially referring to these pillars of gemstone that are Aedyr. It's more than just a green crystal that we see throughout the world, and you do see it throughout the world. It's also really important, as it says here, we cherish Aedyr, we build our temples around it, and we study its potential as an energy source. It's very central to religions within this world, and it's also central to essence, which is, like I said, it's the stuff souls are made of, but it's also found in any living thing, and so it is a potential energy source. So it's really important in science, it's really important in metaphysics and in religion. It's important and central to a lot of what we see within the world of Eora at large. As it says in the second paragraph here, Aedyr is so much more. When we die, Aedyr is the road to which our souls travel into the beyond. The word beyond is capitalized because that's essentially, for lack of a better word, and I'm rolling my eyes at saying this, but it's the underworld. It's where you go after you die. It's where your soul goes anyways after you die. It's not here. It's there. It's the beyond. And so that's where the souls go when they die, and they, theoretically speaking, they go through the Aedyr, this gemstone that you see throughout the world. Your soul, when it leaves your body when you die, goes through the Aedyr to get to where the beyond is, which is a really interesting concept, that this Aedyr is somehow connected to the beyond. And it's through Aedyr, again, theoretically speaking, that the souls return from the beyond to get back into our world, our mundane world again, where they enter into a new body, and now you have a new person, a new body with the same soul from a past life. And that's the cycle of reincarnation. And so it closes off saying, when you find yourself in the presence of Aedyr, take a moment to ponder your place in the Great Wheel. The wheel, here capitalized again, refers to that cycle of reincarnation. It's referred to as the wheel. And the writer of this book is saying, take a moment to ponder your place in the Great Wheel, because you're standing in front of this piece of Aedyr, which is potentially a piece of Aedyr that a soul, maybe even your soul, went through to go to the beyond and even come back from. It might be the place that your soul got to your body from. Who knows? So take a moment to consider who you might have been in a past life, who you are in your current life, and what future lives you might live, because this Aedyr was here to cycle these souls through the wheel. And that is what this book is talking about, and that's the lore behind that. So that's everything for today's episode. Thanks, everybody, for listening to it. This was a really fun one to do. I don't know when this is going to come out. I recorded a different episode before this one, and then I realized this is the episode I wanted to come out quickly, so hopefully I got this out in time. If you enjoyed today's episode, please let me know. worldofeora@gmail.com is the place to do so. You can follow me on Twitter @worldofeora. And if you're interested in supporting the show, you can do so at ko-fi.com/worldofeora. I don't expect anyone to do that, but I provide it for anyone who is interested in supporting the shows that they enjoy. Normally, I would close off the episode giving a little spiel on what game I've been playing lately, but I've just been playing Avowed. I am currently, I think, 2/3 or maybe even 3/4 of the way through the entirety of the game, and I'm going fairly completionist on this run-through that I've had. I have mostly been playing a good guy, mostly aligning with the living lands, not Aedyr or Steel Garrote, and I have been pretty fiercely against the Steel Garrote, which I'm impressed by on Obsidian's part. Usually I play very neutral for everybody until the point of no return when I have to pick somebody. But I have found myself very much against the Steel Garrote and the things that they are doing, and my normal neutral pathway has actually led to a lot of really interesting results in the narrative that I definitely didn't want, per se, and so I've kind of ended up choosing a side far before the end of the game. So congratulations, Obsidian, on getting this old gamer to change some of his habits. I'm still really enjoying the game. I think I talked last time about worrying about the combat being too samey, and I can happily report that even after dozens of hours since recording that episode of gameplay, I really am enjoying the combat. I largely haven't changed my strategy. I'm still mainly using an arquebus as a rifle to shoot guys from afar, but I've also been using a higher tier grimoire to cast spells, as well as an axe to hit anybody if they get a little too close, and I've been playing the same strategy for me pretty much every single combat encounter, which could sound samey, but it's still just good fun. And I'm almost like, I'm a little past 40 hours at this point, and it's just fun. The combat is fun. There's a couple moments when I wish I could be a little more sneaky, where like I don't have to wait so often for people to not notice me, or I have to use an ability that sucks a lot of my essence away that I would like to use magic on if things get out of hand. But I've kind of leaned into it, and I've just decided to go balls to the wall and go crazy with the combat, and it's been a lot of fun. I am still getting very thoroughly rewarded through exploration, and I've kind of come up with a little procedure on how to explore an area very thoroughly, and it's just been really interesting learning that. I'm taking screenshots of every piece of note and dialogue that I think is important, and there's just so much about the world that I want to know, and I'm at this point where I'm like hungry to know what the next narrative beat is, but I have to explore the world because I'm doing a podcast on this place, so I have to really explore the setting and get as much out of it as I can. And so like I'm at that point where I'm like, I want to know what happens next, but I have to hold myself back at this point. So I'm hopeful that I will be done Shatterscarp soon and going into one of the more final regions of the game, which is Galloway's Tusks, and I'm really excited to see what happens there. That's kind of where I'm at now. And yeah, I'm still really enjoying the game, and I can't wait to continue playing it. If you want to share your experiences with Avowed and just have talks about it, send me an email, worldofeora@gmail.com. If you are jumping into Pillars of Eternity for the first time because you played Avowed and you want to talk about it, again, send me an email about it because Pillars of Eternity is great, and I think everyone should play it. Thanks everyone for listening to this episode. Thanks Obsidian for making a bunch of great games, and yeah, my name is Eric, aka Gingerino, and I will see you guys next time.